Welcome to the capstone event of the Outlook for Brazilian Democracy series. This event is co-organized by the University of Chicago Center for Latin American Studies, the Institute of Politics, UChicago Global, and International House. My name is Arthur Schott-Lopez, and I am a fourth-year PhD candidate in the History Department studying Brazilian economic and political history. I have been one of the co-organizers of the Outlook for Brazilian Democracy series with three other esteemed colleagues and under the direction of Professor Ben Lessing. Thank you, Ben, and thank you to the IOP for allowing me to introduce our illustrious guest today. We could not have asked for a more perfect speaker to close out our series. President Dilma Rousseff's life is intimately tied up with the recent vicissitudes of Brazilian democracy. Born in 1947, the daughter of a Bulgarian immigrant and a teacher, Rousseff first became involved with political activism in high school. When a United States-backed military coup ousted democratically elected President João Goulart in 1964, she joined an anti-dictatorship militancy group. 6 years later, in 1970, Rousseff was arrested and tortured by state security forces for her involvement in anti-regime resistance. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Rousseff became involved in Brazil's renascent democracy. Her background in economics led her to county and state political office, in which she oversaw the economy and energy management. After President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's 2002 win, he appointed Rousseff as Minister of Energy, and in 2005, she became President Lula's Chief of Staff, the first woman to occupy that key ministerial position in Brazil's presidential cabinet. In 2010, Rousseff became the first woman to be elected president in Brazilian history. One of her presidency's greatest legacies was the creation of a National Truth Commission to investigate the crimes committed by the Brazilian state during the Brazilian dictatorship. And building on the previous administration's record, Rousseff deepened the Brazilian state's commitment to social and economic inclusion, a challenging endeavor in one of the most unequal countries in the world, and one that has been contested at every turn. As Ben has already said, Rousseff's administration and the outlook for Brazilian democracy both took a downturn in the mid-2010s when economic and political crises rattled the country and culminated in Rousseff's controversial 2016 impeachment. It must be said, however, that even during such tempestuous times, Rousseff remained committed to Brazil's democratic architecture. Unlike her successor, Jair Bolsonaro, she never meddled with state institutions like the federal police or the Attorney General's office, even when they began investigating corruption in her government, and she left office peacefully after her ouster. Her storied life has much to teach us about how democracies thrive and how they die, and it is an honor and a privilege to be here with her today. We are also lucky to have as today's moderator, Simon Romero, a national correspondent for the New York Times. Before joining the paper's national team, he was a correspondent for the Times in Latin America, working as bureau chief in Brazil and the Andes. He covered critical developments in Brazil, including its political upheavals in the 2010s and rising deforestation in the Amazon. After today's moderated discussion, we will open up the event to audience Q&A. If you have a question, please remain seated and raise your hand. Staff will be walking around with microphones. Students will be prioritized to ask the first questions. Finally, please turn off or silence your cell phones. Parabéns, bem-vinda e obrigado, Presidenta. Esteemed guests, please give a warm welcome to Simon Romero and President Dilma Rousseff.
It is an honor to be here with you, with all of you here, to talk about the delicate situation where Brazil stands right now. I would like to start with a question about the result of the elections, not here, but in Brazil. And this polarization, which still exists in the country, with so many protests, so many ongoing manifestations, how will Lula be able to govern in such a situation? Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation. I'd like to tell you that it is an opportunity, a very challenging opportunity to be able to dialogue with you here. And I'd also like to say that it is a pleasure to be here with the person that interviewed me when I was president. It's a very well-known journalist, so it really is a pleasure to be here with you. So, first of all, to answer your question, first of all, I'd like to clarify one issue. This polarization is never a will. Brazilian society is not polarized. If there's a level of inequality which is frightening, this level of inequality has to do with the specific features of Brazilian inequality, a country that had 350 years of slavery. Perhaps the longest slavery of the colonial times, takes a long time to free itself. And remembering that this process is a process that still has not completed itself, because we've never had a welfare, a society, a just society. The workers of the PT and Lula's party and my party, what they've done is a reduction of the inequality, which still had not touched on the foundation of this inequality. For example, the observed regression of the tax system that doesn't tax capital gains, only salary gains. We do not tax this because it doesn't go through Congress. So this society is polarized. This has never been polarized with hate and bias and a dispute with the appearance of the ultra-right in Brazil. President Lula will have a huge challenge, and I believe he is extremely prepared. Let us remember that President Lula was in jail for 580 days in a situation when you are in jail for political reasons, knowing that you are innocent. So this sensation is, how can I say, I think it's, one feels very indignant, but today I believe that we have a huge challenge ahead of us. Bolsonaro, the current president, when he took over the government in 2019, he was here in February and he had a meeting with a group led by Steve Bannon, a group of the ultra-right, the American extreme right, and he declared in front of all these people and the journalists that he had not reached the Brazilian government to build, but to destroy what the leftists, who are us, what we had built. So what he wanted to do was to refer to some things that I'd like to mention right now. The issue of the environment, for example. In fact, he destructured two things: the mechanisms that regulate and survey the environment, and the system itself, the technological system, the satellite system to control, questioning the National Research Institute, because he denies every dimension. So today you have a very serious process in the environment, deforestation, which is totally unnecessary due to failure, because it's not like the energy system. It's not dealing with deforestation. It's something possible. We reduced this deforestation to a position where we were going to the legal zero, and then the deforestation zero under any circumstance. All of this he deconstructed. However, there are much more serious things. A country has to be measured by its capacity of not allowing people to go hungry. In 2014, after my years and President Lula's years, we were removed from the UN map of hunger, which is a math that UN does about feeding and the access that people have to basic food and protein.
O que ficava era residual, que era necessário você fazer uma política de busca ativa.
Was left was residual, so you had to actively search to find that, because people didn't know that they were entitled to certain policies. So this is how we stood. Well, two other countries, Indonesia and China, were just like us. Well, no other country went back to the hunger map, the UN hunger map. Well, Brazil today has 33 million people in the situation of severe starvation. That is the severe lack of appropriate food. And if you put together the mild and the moderate ones, you're going to reach to a certain percentage that is appalling. So we got to a bit more than half, 112 million. I do not recall whether it's 111 or 112 million, but that's a distraction process. So you take a step back, so you give up on that policy to eliminate misery and hunger, because this is just the beginning. No country just, leaves that behind. As the country leaves that situation behind, people want more. They want access to education, access to health services. So the dismantling of social services, the paralyzing of construction works. And in addition to that, there's something else that was quite severe. I mean, the erosion of democracy. It was an institutional erosion. And Lula, the president, will have to fight against all of that. How is he dealing with that politically? So he built this democratic front. And in the political spectrum in Brazil, which is not an ultra-right spectrum, our traditional opponents, they were Democrats. Of course, there was a point in time in which they fell into the temptation of not accepting the electoral results. The first thing they did, after I won the elections, they wanted to recount the votes. And this is how everything began. And they were accomplices of that. I want to make it clear that Bolsonaro was not in charge of the coup d'etat against me in 2016, and he did not arrest Lula. Bolsonaro inherited this kind of politics. Bolsonaro grew by destroying the democratic center. This is how he grew. He destroyed the democratic core, and then Bolsonaro grew. So all of us who experience ultra-right processes in our countries, we have to wonder, why do they happen? What explains that? Because in the world, there are so many movements that are leading to the emergence of the ultra-right wing. And this we can only fight against with a bigger front, a democratic front. And at the same time, all democratic fronts, they have the issues of their internal differences. At the same time, we'll have to reestablish democracy. We'll have to reinforce, bolster democracy. will have to deal with the crisis, overcome the institutional crisis that led to the erosion of democracy, because there are imbalances between the roles of the different institutions. I mean, the judiciary system, the legislative system. And in the case of the legislative system, Lula has a huge challenge ahead of him. And the other day, we were talking and discussing whether it would be better to be presidentialist or parliamentarist, different systems. In my opinion, is that it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. Let me tell you why. Because in Brazil, we are not living a parliament-based system or a president-based system. Well, it is a system that we can call physiological clientelism. Have you heard about secret budgeting? What characterizes, the budgeting? It should be public, right? It should be the object of accountability. That is, it should be subject to scrutiny, right? It should be transparent. The budget, should be transparent, how it is spent. I mean, because the state receives, investments of X billion reals, and the other state receives much less. So we should know why. That's the kind of rendering of accounts that he concealed, because he was kept in power, transforming the presidency of the higher house into the institution that develops the budget. Yeah, President, I have a question about this budget point, about Bolsonaro administration. He's going to be in power up until the end of the year, we know that. And I have a question about the performance of the institutions during his administration. We do have the federal police, we have the roadway police, we have the FUNAI, that is the Indigenous Institute, we have the INPE. Yeah, there are many institutions, yes. There is the legislative system. We have the Court of Accounts as well, the TCU. So we have this entire structure that oversees the public accounts. The Court of Accounts and the Prosecutor's Office, the Federal Prosecutor's Office. So we have all of those institutions. But what happens in the Bolsonaro administration, and I do think that it happens in the ultra-right administrations, at least that is the case in Brazil. So we see the hardening of the institutions. First, they take too long to react, and then they do react. Well, in Brazil, we must acknowledge the important role that was played by the Supreme Court and the different levels of the courts, and also the electoral courts, because they were fighting the mechanisms through which Bolsonaro was trying to build the coup. Here, you had the invasion of the Capitolium, but in Brazil, they were questioning the electronic ballots, the electronic voting system, because the electronic voting system, it was not audited. So he claimed that if he lost the elections, there would be suspicion on the electronic voting system in Brazil, the electronic ballots. So the Supreme Court, the Electoral Court, they played an important role in that case. But we should never forget that all of the things that happened, they followed through. I mean, people took to the streets and they wanted to have military intervention back. This is what people were claiming. This is not democratic right. Asking for military intervention, this is actually challenging the Constitution that will not allow for that, of course. Well, a certain level of political violence is not a democratic right. This is not a democratic right to use fake news. There are so many things that are not linked to democratic rights. And on the side of the Brazilian society, there was not sufficient organization to prevent, for example, the disaster of the pandemic and the management of the pandemic. There was denial for a long period, denial about the vaccination, the defense of the chloroquine, the medication. And they were using, mechanisms that compromised millions of lives.
O que acontece? É necessário haver
So,
uma CPI.
there must be an investigation process, the CPI. So accusations are made in such investigational processes, but there have been no consequences. I mean, penalizing and punishing, well, that's the basis. It shows that you were not an accomplice with the very severe issues in terms of vaccination. There is an explicit accusation. There were people who were, involved, and there were monetary deviations, fund deviations. Open threats were seen as well. Well, the Supreme Court didn't need much. I mean, you just ask, two corporals to go there and do the job. So I think it's quite complicated to deal with that. We had institutional failure. We had little participation of the democratic bodies, because after all of that, how can we explain that we had such a small difference in the vote?
Esse ano é de quase 100 bilhões de dólares, que é 400 bilhões de reais. Ele jogou dinheiro pelo helicóptero.
Well,
ele deu dinheiro sistematicamente tentando conseguir os votos da população mais pobre do Brasil.
Well, the poorest population of Brazil. It happens that the poorest population in Brazil got the money and didn't vote for him.
Você tem segmento dessa população de
There is a segment of this population here. They earn up to 2 minimum wages.
Em torno de uns 40%.
Let's say that it amounts to 40% of the population, and then from 2 to 5 minimum wages, you have 30% or perhaps less of the population. So this share of the population was lost. This is the population that we lost. So one must understand that there was a whole social development. Bolsonarism, as we call it, they were not defeated in this election. It's just like, the defeat of any ultra-right movement. It implies not only an electoral process, it entails a societal process. A discussion in society must happen. And this is when we see polarizing. When we take into account polarizing, we must analyze the mechanisms that lead to the emergence of the ultra-right. And I began speaking about slavery. So one of the factors is slavery, because it's a control method. It's a submission method that took place for 350 years, and it was the harshest, the most harsh repression that could have happened. So social control was done through violence, mostly in Brazil. And this has shaped two important segments. The elite that the elite, well, with people that defended that people should be educated and that people should be entitled to voting. Well, and I always repeat that because it's important to be said. In the Spanish Americas, it happened quite early. It was in the 18th or 19th century. We only had universities in the 20th century because an enslaved population, why should we educate them? Because you do not reckon the citizenship of this population. So then we had the shaping of the elite. And our people is black and brown. Brazil is black and brown. So there was this theory of the whitening that took place for a long time. It prevailed for a long time. But our people is black and brown, more than 50% of the population in Brazil. We're going to have the demographic census. And in 2010, we saw that 54 to 56 of the population is black and brown, according to the Statistical Institute in Brazil. So this is a very important fact. The racial issue in Brazil is not a minority issue. The racial issue in Brazil has to do with the majority of the population. The social difference in Brazil is linked to Black people and to women. So if you are to develop social programs in Brazil, focus on women. Yeah, and do that. You know why? Because women in the Brazilian society and in Brazilian families, well, first, 25% of the households are led by women, and women play a very important private role in the households. Women take care of the youth, of the children. And if you are to make a chart in Brazil, you will find out that inequalities affect more children. You know why? Because the elderly had many, guarantees. They had their retirements, they had continued benefits. So who were the poor people? The children and the youth were the poor people. So how can we reach out to children and youth? There's only one way of doing that, through family. As Lula said, women do not drink up the support benefit. They give it to their children. Women do not sell their own house because this is where they raise their children. So dealing with women, addressing women, it's not only about dealing with gender. It's about a social issue. I mean, social policy has to be developed, but we must focus on women and on Black people. And we're not able to develop social policies in Brazil without doing it for the big masses. So let me tell you what happens today. Well, this entire structure was dismantled. Yes, it was somehow dismantled, but it was not forgotten. And we have remainders spread out. So we had this fundamental management instrument that is, you cannot develop, social programs. You cannot fight inequalities as we have without having a credible database, without knowing who's who, where they are, where they live, how many children people have, how is their housing situation, because you must focus. There are certain funds. We have, reserved funds. Well, and try to change the budget to see, the taxation structure in Brazil. Try and change those allocated funds. It's tough to deal with the taxation structure. Let me ask about the relationship between the United States and Brazil. I was there during your administrations, and we had highs and lows, successes and failures. We had the espionage episode that took place in the United States, and then the vice president was sent to deal with that, Mr. Biden. So you've met Mr. Biden, the president. So how do you think the relationship will go in the next administration? Well, at least in my administration and in Lula's previous administrations, I think we've had a high-level relationship with the United States. Especially by the end of Lula's administration, Obama took office, and it was a crisis moment. He had to face a quite difficult situation. And Latin America was in charge of Vice President Biden, including Brazil. And I had a very good relationship with Mr. Biden at the time. As you may well know, I had to express my discontentment when they announced that my staff, my cabinet, had been scrutinized by the NSA as well as Petrobras. And of course, we were questioning, we were challenging. I mean, if we are strategic allies, how can you warrant espionage? What did you want to know from us? And we wanted to know from you what you were looking for. One. Two. What were you searching for? What was this scrutiny about? What was the issue with Petrobras at the time? And of course, these are tough questions to be answered. They were never fully answered. And somehow I understand why.
O presidente Obama foi extremamente
Obama, the
correto
president at the
comigo no
time,
sentido de
he was
nunca
very rightful with me
tentar dourar a pílula. Ou
because
seja,
he's
reconheceu
never
que
tried
tinha
to conceal
acontecido e tal.
things.
E
He acknowledged
o
the facts
vice-presidente
and what
Biden
had
também.
happened. And
Então,
Vice President Biden
isso
did
foi
so
assim,
as well.
vamos dizer assim, traumático.
This was traumatic to
Traumático,
us.
mas não impediu que a gente continuasse
Well, it was traumatic to us, but it did not prevent us from following through with the relationship.
Eu tinha uma visita
Well,
de
you
Estado
should agree
marcada.
with me because I had this state
Acontecer
visit
daí
that was
eu
scheduled.
acho que é mês,
It was
mês e
about to
meio.
happen a month
E eu disse
away.
para o presidente Obama,
And then I
não
told
dá para ir,
President
porque
Obama,
eu vou botar
I
o
should
pé
not visit
aqui nos
you
Estados
now
Unidos e a imprensa
because I'm going to set
vai
foot
me
in the
perguntar
United
o quê?
States and the press
Vai
is
querer
going to
saber o
ask me
quê?
questions.
Como é que foi?
They will
O
want to know
O
things.
que
What
espionaram?
happened?
Como é que foi espionagem?
What were they
Então,
spying
você
on?
perde completamente uma agenda de construção,
We
de
lost this
parcerias
construction
e que
agenda.
tenha
It was an
outro nível.
agenda
Então,
aiming at building
isso foi
partnerships,
adiado, de fato.
This was
E
lost,
aí eu
and
quero
this was truly
reconhecer que
postponed at the
nesse
time.
adiamento,
And I would like to
para
acknowledge
depois
that by
retomar
postponing,
as condições,
and then later, of course, we
o
wanted to resume the previous
vice-presidente Biden foi
conditions,
muito hábil.
the Vice
Tanto é que
President Biden
passou
was quite
ano, foi
skillful.
possível fazer
So after 1 year, it was possible for us to come
essa viagem.
and
E é responsabilidade
visit.
direta dele. Ele foi
And it
quem
is his
construiu as
responsibility
condições para que
for,
houvesse,
allowing this
vamos dizer
visit
assim,
to happen. He
dano,
gave us the proper conditions. He
extremamente
prevented damage
elevado
from
nas
happening.
relações. Na mesma época,
He prevented,
quero lembrar
severe
vocês
damage in our
que
relationship. At the same time, and I would like to
Angela
remind
Merkel
you
também foi
that
objeto
Angela
da
Merkel,
referida
the
grampeação
prime
da
minister
NSA.
in Germany,
E
she was
também,
tapped by the NSA as well.
você entende? A partir daí começou a se discutir muito
And
essa
then
questão
this discussion began.
de como é que as redes e o
That is,
sistema
the system,
de
the
surveillância,
networks, the
tradução
surveillance
portuguesa para lá,
systems,
de controle da
the
informação e de
control,
controle
the information
dos
control
dados, ela
systems,
ocorre.
and the data
Então,
control system. So we
eu
were
acredito
questioning on
que
how this should happen.
teve altos e baixos.
So I
Mas
do
se
believe we had
manteve, eu
highs
acho,
and lows,
nível de
successes
respeito
and failures, but I think
que eu acho
respect
fundamental
was
nas
kept.
relações.
The level of respect was
Agora, o
kept, and I
Brasil
think it's
tinha uma
fundamental for the
política externa
relationships.
que
But
baseava-se na
Brazil had this
preferência para a
foreign
América Latina,
policy
por causa que era
that was based
a
on a
nossa
preference
região,
for Latin
ou seja, o
America
Brasil,
because it is our
no
region.
passado,
I
sempre
mean,
ficou de costa para a América Latina, olhava
Brazil
para a
in the
Europa e para os
past
Estados Unidos, e
turned
não
its
via
back to
a
Latin
América
America,
Latina.
would look up to the
Nós
United
demos
States
uma
and to
prioridade
Europe and
muito
would
grande à
not
América
see
Latina.
Latin
Nós
America. We
percebemos que a integração
prioritized Latin
regional
America
é uma questão,
because we realized
o
that
Brasil não
regional
pode ter uma
integration
política
is
de se
an
colocar
important
como
matter.
país
Of course,
imperialista perante uma série
Brazil
de países
should not be
menores.
an imperialistic
A
country
América
vis-à-vis
Latina
other
precisa de ter
smaller
tratamento
countries.
especial nosso,
Latin America
prioritário.
must,
A África,
rely
nós
on our
temos
priority.
reconhecimento profundo em relação às
Africa.
nossas
We
relações
deeply
com a África,
acknowledge our
principalmente com a
relationships
África
with
de língua.
Africa,
Nós tem uma parte da
especially
África que é de
with
língua
the
portuguesa, mas não só
Portuguese-speaking
ela,
African
toda a nossa
countries, but
origem
not only
ali
these countries.
na chamada costa dos
We
escravos ou costa
originate
da
from
mina.
as
E
they call it,
precisamos
the
dessa
enslaved
relação e
coast,
consideramos que
the
a
mining
África
coast.
é
And
o
we do need to
continente
rely on this
que vai
relationship
ser
with
muito
Africa. And we
importante
do
no
believe
futuro.
that Africa is
onde
going to be a
tem
quite
as
relevant
maiores taxas de
continent in the
natalidade,
future.
onde tem
This is where we have the
a
high
possibilidade de
mortality
você ter
rates.
outro
Well,
tipo de
but there
desenvolvimento.
we could
De
have
outra
a
parte,
totally
nós
different
temos e
kind of
demos importância muito
development
grande aos dois.
approach.
Brasil,
So we
Rússia,
gave a
China,
great deal
Índia
of
e África do
importance to
Sul,
Brazil, Russia, China,
principalmente
India,
fazendo o
and
Banco dos
South
BRICS, o
Africa,
acordo contingente de
especially
reservas, que
developing the
era
BRIC Bank
acordo
and the
cambial
reserve
que
system
dava
that was an
suporte para as
exchange
moedas dos
agreement
respectivos
that would
países.
support
Tivemos
the
uma
currencies of
relação
these
também
countries.
com toda
Of
a
course,
Ásia
we also
e
had
com o
a
Japão.
good relationship with Asia
Então,
and
eu
with
acredito
Japan.
que neste
So
quadro,
I do believe that
nós reconhecemos, eu
based
acho
on
uma coisa
this
muito importante, que o
scenario,
mundo era multipolar.
we do
E que
acknowledge
para os
that,
interesses do Brasil, essa multipolaridade tinha
the
de ser
world
afirmada.
was diverse.
Agora, que você tem de manter padrão de
But
relacionamento de alta
you have to
qualidade
keep a certain
com todos
high
os
quality
países,
relationship with all of the
principalmente
countries.
mantendo
You must do
duas
that,
coisas:
especially,
a soberania e a
maintaining
independência do
two
país.
things. sovereignty and independence of the countries.
We are together with the countries that respect our sovereignty. And do we have problems? Who doesn't have problems? So I believe that in general, I think we are hopeful in relation to the rest of the world, because the foreign policy of Brazil wasn't a disaster. It's more than a disaster, an error. As the philosopher used to say, it's more than a mistake. Now, a question about the Amazon. Lula traveled to Egypt. He was received with applause in the COP meeting, but a lot of things has happened. Deforestation, the growth of this agriculture, border, and projects that started during his government and advanced a lot. So what has to be done? Well, the projects you're talking about is Belmonte. This is something that's over. But what has, well, this is not my government. I was involved in this before, when I worked for Lula, yes, of course. Now, the world is waiting to see what's going to happen with the Amazon. Well, I want to tell you the following. I believe what was the differential of Brazil in relation to climate change and the environment. It was a very consistent policy in relation to deforestation. And the other day, I said this in an emphatic manner, because it's important to know about this. You can't stop deforestation, and it's not only deforestation, it's not only this. The problem is that there's a lot of potassium, gold, minerals, and what we call other minerals that are used for nuclear reasons. We are very rich in minerals. One of the most important things for fertilizers is potassium. One of the biggest reserves is in the Amazon. You know what? Underneath the Amazon River, because everyone that has satellites knows this. So, what is, of course, there is a part. Do people want to deforest to plant or for cattle raising? The goal of deforestation is mineral exploitation. It's not only cattle. The area which is closer to Brazil is the area of Cerrado. So, in the Amazon is a secondary part of the agro-business, but it has to be controlled. You cannot contain deforestation without an effective introduction of the military, the police, and state contention. So those who are caught no longer have access to credit. This was the instrument that we had. You don't have credit in any public banks. And the central bank intervenes for them not to have private credit. This is the level that it has to be done. The concern of the consequences have to be the person has to be very concerned with the consequences, otherwise the temptation is huge. There are 20 million people in the Amazon, so the Amazon has to have a policy to give these people jobs. Jobs that do not exploit the forest. Basically, you have to have a specific policy for the duty-free zone in Manaus and other areas. Third thing, there's a low-level income part of the population that cannot just have the alternative of deforestation and planting for survival. You have to have what they call money that pays the person to use or to manage the forest. It's possible. So this person has to earn to do this. So that's how we were able to reduce the deforestation to the lowest level in all the history. This is not my merit. This was started in Lula's government and it ended in my government. President Lula has a commitment. This commitment is ours. A commitment with the future Paris Agreement. We've had an important role in this agreement. Why? Due to another very specific issue of Brazil. We are a hydroelectrical country. 60% of the Brazilian energy, the source is hydroelectricity. Of this 60%, a large part is based in large reservoirs. These large reservoirs are the base for wind farms and sun. It's not sunny every day, and there's not wind every day either. So you cannot expect this is a sort, when it doesn't work, well, then the hydroelectric works. So Brazil does not have coal. It has 2 plants that run on coal, as far as I know, 2 in the south of the country, and the 2 thermonuclear plants. How can this become feasible? You could no longer just have hydro. Hydrothermal, on the thermal side, it's gas. Gas, basically gas. And in some remote areas, there was diesel, which we removed. And also, we produced from 20 years forward. So this matrix is a manageable one. Why? Because it's easier for you to produce alternative energy in such a matrix. You don't depend on coal, and you don't depend on fuel, that are the 2 that pollute the most. Gas is transition energy. So Brazil has to have an aggressive policy against deforestation, also with the relationship between forests and agriculture. And also we had goals that are extremely, compared to other countries, very ambitious. And we executed these policies. This is a characteristic of our commitments to reduce gas emissions, while an average of 17%, we reached 30-something%. This process is a process that one sector of the Brazilian society, minority but dominant, was against, because they said that this would benefit indigenous people, because there's also another environmental problem linked to the indigenous people because they're Indian reserves, forest reserves. There are all sorts of types of reserves, and we did something called the Forest Code. What is the Forest Code? The Forest Code, in truth, is the following. All properties in Brazil, they have to maintain an area, a specific area. So let's suppose that this is in the Amazon. The person has, I don't know, 100 hectares. They cannot use 80. They can use only 20. 80 has to have a reserve. So it's untouchable. When you reach the southeast and the center-west, this relationship changes. There. The more it's used by men, that is what we did. The agro-business did not like, and this went through Congress, but there was a huge resistance. But this was very important for a sustainable environment policy. This is not only the climate change, it's to have green development. So you have to have this commitment. You cannot occupy the tops of hills, for example. So we still are, and we will be. Today, President Lula spoke reaffirming our commitments and saying that for us, this is a non-negotiable item. We are going to take over all the environmental control. We are not going to deny satellites because our president denies satellites, denies the research agencies. So everything that we've done in terms of the environment, and we are not those who started. It's an advantage. We know how we do things in Brazil, but of course, it's different to rebuild everything. That is going to be a lot of hard work. I have a question about your past and your present. You were part of a guerrilla group. You were put in jail. You were tortured. Yes. How was it to be a president of, how was it a president of the Republic that praises torturers, that talks about the dictatorship as if it was a happy town? How has this experience panned out? Well, I'll tell you. It was very offensive. It's not only something personal. A lot of people died in Brazil. Yesterday, I met, I believe he's a teacher. No, he's a teacher who's a relative of a girl who was in jail with me. And I met her in a place that was in investigation of crimes of the military, where because I was, sometimes you were in jail and you were interrogated again, but I was already ancient there. So when you're ancient, you become experienced. That means you're capable. You know. Once I said this, in the dictatorship, you lie. In democracy, you say the truth. Because in dictatorship, if you say the truth, your companions will be killed. So you lie. You have to learn how to lie. It's something, especially depending on your education, it's an effort, because your mother tells you you should not lie. Okay, So, but you have to lie. So I met. This girl was very much tortured. She was 2 years younger, and at that time we thought the person was really much younger. 3 years younger was really much, much younger. So I saw her suffering. One thing is for you to see someone else suffering. For you to suffer in some moments, if you've undergone suffering, to see another person suffering, it hurts a lot. So at that time, I think that a lot of people died. A lot of people die being tortured. It's very sad. Torture is, how can I say, is if you were in that threshold that you can die. It has a component that affects each of your cells because there's pain and you learn a lot, and I don't advise this. So one day, I knew who this person was. He was part of a historian about dictatorship, said he was part of Tigrada. What is Tigrada? It's the part of the Brazilian repression that was committed with repression. So this is his origin, and he was considered by the armed forces, by the top of the armed forces, and he was a low-class official because he wanted to put bombs in some military areas to request higher salaries. And President Geisel at that time, he was laid off with dishonors. He was promoted to captain, so that's his story. But he becomes a parliamentary politician during 30 years, and when it is the impeachment, he votes and he greets torturers. One of the Brazilian who was, he greets a well-known, and he says he was going to vote on my impeachment in honor of this person. But he does this in an absurd way.
And then the president of the Brazilian bar was killed by being tortured. And then when the president criticizes him, he says, I'm going to tell you how your father died. Because it's really an erosion of values. But what's more severe is not that. It's actually the defense of the military intervention as a method, as a top moment of Brazil. He says that dictatorship should rule. This is the path that we should take. And he upholds military intervention. I think that's very serious. That's the most serious thing. In a country like Brazil, why was it possible? You know why this happened? Because most often in Brazil, transitions or the transition phases from monarchy to republic, and then from dictatorship to democracy, everything has been negotiated. And it's different from Argentina, for example. Well, Netflix is showing this movie called 1985 with Roberto Darwi. It's an Argentinian movie. It's a high-quality movie. And it depicts the condemnation of all, or at least of most, Some of them were, sentenced to life, to spend life in prison. I mean, all of the heads of the air forces, the army, and the navy. So in some countries, it's virtually impossible to go back to dictatorship. Well, in Brazil, the transition was negotiated. This is shown in the article number 142 from our constitution. So the institution participated of the introduction of democracy in Brazil. So, and it's not because they were, beautiful, bright, or talented men and women. It has to do with the Brazilian politics. It was a negotiation. And this is, this boils down to reciprocal amnesty. The repression of the state, the terrorist acts of the state cannot be equivalent to acts of smaller organizations. They're not equivalent. They're not the same. The weight of the state, the strength of the state is very sound. And this happens when processes are not discussed. The terms and conditions for transition are not discussed. Our transition was negotiated, and we've never been able. And let me tell you. So how many years have I developed? How many years after that math have I developed the Commission of the Truth? This was just in the 21st century that was able to, set forth the Commission of the Truth. And the facts took place in 1970, from 1970 to 1980. So the Commission of the Truth, it was not a process that is equivalent to that is reported on the movie 1985. What is the Commission of the Truth? It is about reconstructing the memory. There is no forgiveness. It's not a matter of forgiving. It's the historical memoirs, and we must preserve it to have an effect on your own country. And I should tell you that I am, from this generation, the 1968, 1964 generation. You know what happened in 1968 in the world. So what was the problem with us? The problem with my generation is that we came from this system, this regime in Brazil that was somewhat democratic. They were attempting to do some reforms. Looking from today, these were small reforms. And then there was this military coup d'etat. So my generation has this terrible thing because they did not believe that in Brazil it was possible to have democracy. But my generation did believe in that. So there was disbelief in democracy. That's quite serious in a society, very, very serious in a society. Because, when there is, part of the youth that does not believe in the possibility of democracy. Why is it so? Because it never works out right? Because we are going to have processes as the one that we witnessed in 1964 with the revolution in Brazil. So part of the youth in my time, it was not part of the youth, it was everybody. First, we broke up with the Communist Party. We left it behind. We put it aside. We called it Reformist Party. So we broke up with them. And we proposed to struggle. And this led to the death of so many people. We proposed ourselves to do armed fights. We lost track of the importance of democracy in this transformational process. Well, democracy promises that everybody is equal before the law. It can be, and it is one of the best instruments to organize and support society and societal life. So my generation, So my generation went to prison. If you didn't go to prison, you had to flee overseas. If you didn't do that, you died. That's our story, the story of my generation. I thought that I would spend 16 years in prison. I was just 21. Wow. I spent 3 years. It wasn't much. So look how we thought. Look the thoughts that we had in our mind in that time. So this process in Brazil is a quite interesting process. It took us 21 years between the first coup d'etat and the democracy, I mean the democracy of the new republic. It took us 21 years, and now it took us 8 years to resume democracy. Why 8 years? Because we resisted. I left, the palace. I was the president, and I had to leave the palace. Well, Bolsonaro would have, fought against that. So I told them that we would be back and that we would develop this big front. We would be back in power. President Lula accepted because he could have fled. He could have turned his back. Many people would tell him, flee. He didn't flee. I mean, the condition for you to come back 8 years later is because we resisted and we fought against that. Had we not done that, we wouldn't have the legitimacy to come back. You only build legitimacy to come back if you resist. But there's something else we learn from mistakes as well. In any country of the world, especially in the developing country, the global south country, it's not only about the political parties. Society must organize. There is no way we can support institutional transformations if we are not organized to support such transformations. Well, in Brazil, we only tax salaries and wages. Why is it so? Because when we are to pass the law in the National Congress, we lose. I mean, the financial tax, people didn't want us to charge it. Of course, people are against taxation. I mean, we must fund the state. If you are against taxes, you cannot fund. You have to fund by taxation or by indebtedness, or you do not fund the state. So either we discuss once again what kind of taxes and how it taxes, or it's not going to work. Where, for example, there was this crisis in the United Kingdom, and then this lady wants to reduce taxes. That doesn't work. They didn't want to have the CPMF, that is a financial tax. We charged this financial tax for a while. And when you charge taxes on financial transactions, you know who dodges? You know who are those who dodge it. You have total visibility on the ones that are dodging and how much they're dodging. So, of course, they wanted to stop it from happening. And in order to promote change, okay, we want to invest in education. We must invest in education. And, of course, we do spend money in education. You have to pay well your teachers. We cannot pay a small salary to teachers. There must be laboratories. You must sponsor, educational policies that will take students overseas. We must do that, or there'll be no catching up. We must restructure universities. We must ensure students that they get their grants, or the ones that are joining the universities by quota because they're poor, because they're black, or because they went to public schools. We have to ensure these people that they have their grants. We have to make sure that the university will help him or her to be educated and to attend lessons. So we have to spend money. Where do we get funds from? So a president of the republic took office, and the first thing that he or she has to discuss is where the funds will come from. Oh, let's say I want to develop a housing program, Minha Casa Minha Vida, for example, for families that earn up to 2 minimum wages in Brazil. So this cannot be done. For example, a person that earns less than $100 or $150, a person cannot finance his or her home. Are they going to live in favelas then if they cannot fund their homes? How will their children live? The Bolsa Familia, I mean, the benefit from the government subsidizes, and you have to subsidize an expressive share of the population, and you have to encourage them to pay back. Even if it is a small share of their salaries, they must pay back. So let me interrupt you.
I think we might have time for one
Ms.
or two
President.
questions, if it's possible. With the microphone right over here, yeah. Presidenta Dilma, muito obrigado pela sua luta, pelo seu trabalho e pela visita hoje, por dividir com a gente seu conhecimento.
Thank you so much for your struggle, for sharing your knowledge here with us. My question is, well, Brazil is derelict. Education, science and technology, international relations. So President Lula has great work ahead of him, especially in dealing with the National Congress, a hostile Congress. So what are the absolute priorities in the reconstruction of Brazil? You cannot do everything in 4 years, right? And what are the possibilities within this National Congress that is not a friendly Congress? Well, to us, immediately, we need the so-called package, plan for transition. We need to keep on paying 600 reals as a benefit per family and 150 reals per child as a government benefit, so that later we can fix everything. We can develop a program. There are things that are dysfunctional, but first you have to keep up what people are getting as a government benefit, because Bolsonaro established the program, but he did not include the program in the budgeting. So President Lula is coming back from COP27 to deal with that. He also has to readjust the minimum wage because it's been stuck on the same value for a while. And there are some very specific programs. One of them is the popular pharmacy. This is developed with the private drugstore networks. So the government pays. So the government pays for the medications for chronic diseases, high blood pressure, let's say, and diabetes, for example. Why is that? Because it is much more important for us to have people using and taking their medications when they need, continuous use medication, than, having them going into crisis and not having, hospitals for them or having high hospitalization costs. So this program has to be kept because it really reduces the pressure on the health system. Primary care and secondary care health systems. We have to strengthen the universal health system. But in some cases, we'll have to focus on what will bring, immediate improvement for people. The 600 real benefit cannot be removed. We cannot eliminate this benefit. It is our commitment to keep it up. He had this commitment. He took it on. So it is, very difficult for the congressmen and women. So what is the current discussion? The discussion in Brazil is always very small. The discussion is whether they will approve the 600 real benefit for 4 years or just a single year.
But someone who thinks it can just be 1 year, and this is the issue of the market with Lula. They don't want him to approve it for over a year. So that will be difficult. I think the situation is serious, but what is more important, you have to end the secret budget. The secret budget cannot continue, otherwise you cannot govern. Lula has put together a wide alliance. I believe that he will get the votes that he needs to approve the emergency package. Now, I'm going to tell you, the secret budget is one of the things that I think will be a huge challenge, and this also has to do with the two houses. Of course, in Brazil, we have a serious problem. For you to have an idea, we've had a reduction in the Fernando Henrique government. In the beginning of the new republic, 3 parties had 80% of the congressmen, 80%. Then, in the first Lula government, 56. In the second Lula government, I'm not sure, but something like 42% of the chairs. So what does this mean? That means that you need more and more parties to form the majority. When you talk about 2/3, it's a lot. At my time, in my government, it reached 42. In 2018, 18%. Now it's changed. Why? Because we've reached the conclusion that you have to reduce the number of parties. So, in any case, the parties are amorphous. I don't know what Bolsonaro's party is going to be. It seems it's going to be PL, so an extreme rightist party. And then you have a lot of ambiguity. You have a center that's not a center. It's something it's called big center. And it varies, depending on the cloud. As a leader would say, politics is like a cloud. Sometimes a cloud is like this, sometimes a cloud is like that. So in this story, there are compositions, and the big challenge is that all society knows this, and society knows, like the senator Jucá said, you have to solve this problem with the high courts. You have to stop the bleeding. Bleeding is what is not allowed anymore. At my time, the rule was, if you knee, you pray, you submit it to take from Bolsonaro the exercise of the execution of the investments that are not compulsory. So this is what happens today. It's not even parliamentary or presidents. And I had a relationship with Angela Merkel, and her government and all the budget structure was as centralized as the presidency here in Brazil, with the president system. That means it's exercised with technical criteria more than political. So it's formed by technical criteria, because we don't invent what region of the country needs this most. These are technical criteria. But currently, it's not like that. Today, the criteria is physiological clientele. You vote with the president on this issue, the president of the chamber. The congressman, he takes even more. They say that in this...
Aqueles que votavam com Bolsonaro ganharam até 18 bilhões. Então, isso terá de ser desmontado. Não se desmonta isso assim, ó. Não é assim. É processo.
This will have to be dismantled, and it doesn't work like that. It's a process. That's why we call it a transition administration. Well, they will have to do it quite clearly. It was like this, and it's going to become like this. They will have to set it out. If we do not promote a transition administration, we are not going to tackle all of the issues, but we have to address most of them. The problems have to be addressed, and there must be a plan for addressing them, a clear plan. So what can I reassure you about? I may assure you that Lula is familiar with politics. Lula is familiar with the system. They said with prejudice that Lula is not an administrator. I worked with Lula for 8 years on a daily basis. So we built airports and roadways and everything. Well, it's the federal government that is in charge of the highways. So we began from the north at 8 a.m. So at 7 p.m., we had not yet discussed the central western region of Brazil, because you have to discuss every corner. And he discussed everything, each and every highway and roadway, because it was about a final decision.
A mesma coisa na área de energia. A mesma coisa, como é que nós fizemos o Minha Casa Minha Vida? Também. Então, o Lula sabe.
So how do we do this with the program My House, My Life? So he has natural talent to do politics. Why? Because he was a union negotiator, and at that time, or either he would negotiate or he had no increase for salaries. So if you have this capacity of negotiating, he has it. This is a process. Yes, it is a process. And meanwhile, we have a few agendas that we can accelerate. One of them is the environment. Another are institutional relationships. And we have to re-industrialize Brazil. We are not going to join the fourth revolution if we're not even in the second or third revolution. So you can't just consume platforms. All the countries know this. It's not for free that Biden has to make things happen. We're behind, but we have to notice this, or otherwise we'll be on the outskirts of the outskirts. And this is what cannot happen in Brazil, to be the outskirts of the outskirts, and it doesn't make sense in such a large and rich country and with the capacity of the people. It doesn't make the slightest sense. And I think Lula has come to build the transition. And this implies, in part of the government is not only PT. It is PT. There is no doubt. But it's not only the Workers' Party. It cannot be. There are no forces for this. In this process, we have to be open to criticism. We have to be open to everything that happens in a governmental process. Yeah, you made a mistake. Yeah, you did, but you have to move on. And sometimes you don't recognize your mistake at the time. You recognize it later because there's no time. Okay, President, thank you so much for your words. It's very interesting. Thank you for the question.
Juan de Pablo up to the stage for some closing remarks. Yes.
Juan de Pablo is coming to the stage for some closing remarks.
What a treat. I am Juan de Pablo. I am the Executive Vice President of the University for Science, Innovation, National Labs, and Global Initiatives. I would like to thank you, President Rousseff, muito obrigado, for sharing your perspective with us and for visiting our campus. Thanks also to Simon for your skillful management of the conversation and your probing questions. What a wonderful opportunity to hear such an informed perspective on the future of democracy in one of the most populous countries in the world. Here at the University of Chicago, it is crucial to our mission that we facilitate opportunities for our students and scholars to hear and learn from diverse viewpoints, and also their outlook on the world extends beyond their own communities. Today we heard from everything from the potassium reserves in the Amazon, to the transition to democracy, to the barbarity of torture. Today's event is just a stark example of how important it is to hear the stories of what happened directly from the people that were the authors of those stories, the people that were there. You are a friend of the university, President Rousseff, and in that spirit, I'm looking forward to inviting you again in several years to continue telling us the story of what's happening in Brazil. Thank you very much for joining us today. I want to acknowledge the efforts of Professor Ben Lessing, whose initiative made this event possible, as well as the Center for Latin American Studies, the Institute of Politics, and UChicago Global. If you have not already participated in the early events on the outlook for Brazilian democracy, I invite you to listen to the recordings on the CLAS website. Finally, thank you all of you for coming. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you to our participants. Again, thank you, President Rousseff.